This man and a horse and a dog?" Buck Daniels shuddered, and his colour changed. "Listen," he said. "I've talked enough. You ain't going to get another word out of me except this. Doc, have a good sleep. Get on your hoss tomorrow morning and beat it. Don't even wait for breakfast. Because if you do wait, you may get a hand in this little hell of ours. You may be waiting too." A sudden thought brought him to his feet. He stood over the doctor. "How many times," he thundered, "have you seen Kate Cumberland?" "Today, for the first time." "Well," said Daniels, growling with relief, "you've seen her enough, I know." And he turned towards the door. "Unlock," he commanded. "I'm tired out and sick of talking about him." But the doctor did not move. "Nevertheless," he stated, "you will remain. There is something further which you know, and which you will communicate to me." Buck Daniels turned at the door. His face was not pleasant. "While observing you as you talked with the girl," Byrne said, "it occurred to me that you were holding information from her. The exact nature of that information I cannot state, but it is reasonable to deduce that you could, at the present moment, name the place where the man for whom Mr. Cumberland and his daughter wait is now located." Buck Daniels made no reply, but he returned to his chair and slumped heavily into it, staring at the little doctor. And Byrne realized with a thrill of pleasure that he was not afraid of death. "I may further deduct," said the doctor, "that you will go in person to the place where you know this man may be found and induce him to come to this ranch." The silent anger of Daniels died away. He smiled, and at length he laughed without mirth. "Doc," he said, "if you knew where there was a gun, would that make you want to put it up agin your head and pull the trigger?" But the doctor proceeded inexorably with his deductions. "Because you are aware, Mr. Daniels, that the presence of this man may save the life of Mr. Cumberland, a thought, to be sure, which might not be accepted by the medical fraternity, but which may, without undue exaggeration, devolve from the psychological situation in this house." "Doc," said Daniels huskily, "you talk straight and you act straight, and I think you're a straight. So I'll take off the bridle and talk free. I know where Whistling Dan is, just about. But if I was to go to him and bring him here, I'd bust the heart of Kate Cumberland. Do you understand?" His voice lowered with intense emotion. "I've thought it out sideways and backwards. It's Kate or old Joe. Which is the most important?" The doctor straightened in the chair, polished his glasses, and peered once more at the cowpuncher. "You are quite sure, also, that the return of this man, this strange wanderer, might help Mr. Cumberland back to health?" "I am, all right. He's sure wrapped up in Whistling Dan." "What is the nature of their relations? What makes him so oddly dependent upon the other?" "I dunno, Doc. It's got us all fooled. When Dan is here it seems like old Cumberland jest naturally lives on things Dan does and hears and sees. We've seen Cumberland prick up his ears the minute Dan comes into the room and show life. Sometimes Dan sits with him and tells him what he's been doing. Maybe it ain't any more than how the sky looks that day or about the feel of the wind. But Joe sits with his eyes dreaming, like a little kid hearing fairy stories. Kate says it's been that way since her dad first brought Dan in off'n the range. He's been sort of necessary to old Joe. Almost like air to breathe, I tell you. It's just a picture to see them two together." Very odd, brooded the doctor, frowning. "But this seems to be an odd place and an odd set of people. You've no real idea why Dan left the ranch?" "Ask the wild geese," said Buck bitterly. He added, "Maybe you'd better ask Dan's black hoss or his dog Bart. They know better'n anything else. But what has this man been doing since he left? Have you any idea?" "Get a little chatter now and then of a gent that's rid into a town on a black hoss prettier'n anything that was ever seen before. It's all pretty much the same what news we get. Mostly, I guess, he just wanders around doing no harm to nobody. But once in a while somebody sicks a dog on Bart, and Bart just naturally chaws that dog in two. Then the owner of the dog may start a fight, and Dan drops him and rides on." "With a trail of dead men behind him?" cried the doctor, hunching his shoulders as if to shake off a chill. "Dead? Nope. You don't have to shoot to kill when you can handle a gun the way Dan does. Nope, he just wings 'em. Plants a chunk of lead in a shoulder or an arm or a leg. That's all. There ain't no love of blood in Dan, except " "Well?" "Doc," said Buck with a shudder, "I ain't going to talk about the exceptions. Mostly the news we gets on Dan is about troubles he's had. But sometimes we hear of gents he's helped out when they was sick, and things like that. There ain't nobody like Dan when a gent is down sick, I'll tell a man." The doctor sighed. He said: "And do I understand you to say that the girl and this man, Whistling Dan, as you call him, are intimately and sentimentally related?" "She loves him," said Daniels slowly. "She loves the ground he walks on and the places where he's been." "But, sir, it would seem probable from your own reasoning that the return of the man, in this case, will not be unwelcome to her." "Reason?" broke out Dan bitterly. "What the hell reason's got to do with Whistling Dan? Man, if Barry was to come back, d'you s'pose he'd remember that he once told Kate he loved her? Doc, I know him as near as any man can know him. I tell you he thinks no more of her than the wild geese think of her. If old Joe dies because Dan is away, well, Cumberland is an old man anyway. But how could I stand to see Barry pass Kate by with an empty eye, the way he'd do if he'd come back? I'd want to kill him, and I'd get bumped off trying it, like as not. And what would it do to Kate? It'd kill her, Doc, as sure as you're born." "Your assumption being," muttered the doctor, "that if she never sees the man again she will eventually forget him." "D'you forget a knife that's sticking into you? No, she won't forget him. But maybe after a while she'll be able to stand thinking about him. She gets used to the hurt. She'll be able to talk and laugh the way she used to. Oh, Doc, if you could have seen her as I've seen her in the old days." "When the man was with her?" cut in the doctor. Buck Daniels caught his breath. "Damn your eternal soul, Doc," he said softly. And for a time neither of them spoke. Whatever went on in the mind of Daniels, it was something that contorted his face. As for Byrne, he was trying to match fact and possibility, and he was finding a large gap between the two. For he tried to visualize the man whose presence had been food to old Joe Cumberland, and whose absence had taken the oil from the lamp so that the flame now flickered dimly, nearly out. But he could build no such picture. He could merely draw together a vague abstraction of a man to whom the storm and the wild geese who ride the storm had meaning and relationship. The logic which he loved was breaking to pieces in the hands of Randall Byrne. Silence, after all, is only a name, never a fact. There are noises in the most absolute quiet. If there is not even the sound of a cricket or the wind, if there are not even ghost whispers in the house, there is the sigh of one's own breathing. And in those moments of deadly waiting the beat of the heart may be as loud and as awful as the rattle of the death march. Now, between the doctor and the cowpuncher, such a silence began. Buck Daniels wanted nothing more in the world than to be out of that room, but the eye of the doctor held him, unwilling. And there began once more that eternal waiting, which was the horror of the place, until the faint creakings through the wind-shaken house took on the meaning of footsteps stalking down the hall and pausing at the door, and there was a hushing breath of one who listened and smiled to himself. Now the doctor became aware that the eye of Buck Daniels was widening, brightening. It was as if the mind of the big man were giving way in the strain. His face blanched. Even the lips had no colour, and they moved gibberingly. "Listen," he said. "Is it the wind?" answered the doctor, but his voice was hardly audible. "Listen," commanded Daniels again. The doctor could hear it then. It was a pulse of sound obscure as the thudding of his heart, but it was a human sound, and it made his throat close up tightly, as if a hand were settling around his windpipe. Buck Daniels rose from his chair, that half mad